Okay, so here we are once again for another segment, and today we are going to begin discussing Renaissance literature, Renaissance literature of the Tudor period, or after the name of the great monarch of the time, Queen Elizabeth. This is usually referred to as the Elizabethan period. And there is a tremendous, tremendous flowering forth of literature, of drama, of architecture, music, the various other arts, philosophy. It's a time of great religious energy with all kinds of new religious groups beginning to emerge in England. And this is a period which traditionally has been called the Renaissance, and particularly among art historians, the term is still in general use, though historians are increasingly coming to use the term early modern period for this phase in the development of Western civilization. And basically what was happening was in the latter part of the 15th century, some would say even as early as the latter part of the 14th century, but certainly by the 15th century, we have the development, particularly in Italy, of an enormous new economic and political power being centered in the great city-states of the Italian peninsula. And if we can go to the PowerPoint, we are going to be considering, first of all, how there were enormous increases in capital and in commerce. And this, of course, was going to change the whole structure of Western society, as I mentioned a couple of classes ago, that the movements which had begun in the Central Middle Ages, in the 12th and 13th and then in the 14th centuries, increased in the 15th, 16th, and 17th centuries, and were moving increasingly in the direction of our kind of modern world. Increases in capital and commerce are going to result in economic shifts away from the old feudal aristocracy with its agrarian economic base, and increasingly center capital and commerce in the towns and cities, so whole new classes of affluent and newly powerful peoples are going to emerge. We already saw some suggestions of that kind of thing happening in Chaucer's general prologue to the Canterbury Tales. But this is a process which is going to continue through the 15th and 16th and 17th centuries, as we shall now see. This is also a time of vast European expansion of both territory and markets. Territory in order to lay claim to all kinds of goods, some of them, of course, precious metals, other kinds of goods, which could be brought back to Europe and could be sold at fantastic profits in many cases. And of course, this also meant opening up new markets as well. There is an emergence of nationalism and therefore the beginnings of the formations of some of our nation states. During this period, England really becomes a nation state where the people in England by the end of the 15th century and certainly by the beginning of the 16th century have a powerful sense of themselves now as a single people, as the English. Whereas in the Middle Ages, there still had been a good deal of fragmentation of local identities or into local identities, where the old Norman invaders were viewed as one kind of people and not really English, and the indigenous Anglo-Saxon peoples, or the ones who derived from the indigenous Anglo-Saxon peoples, saw themselves as yet another whole group. And so there were all kinds of divisions of identities, but partly as a result of the 100 Years' War that England carried out against France during the last half of the 14th century and the first half of the 15th century. That was a moment which brought English of different social classes and backgrounds and identities together with a sense that they had common cause. So a whole new ideological identity was being formed at this time in England. Something similar to that was happening in France. Some of the other countries that are going to emerge into modern nation states, such as Germany and Italy, would not do so for a very long time. Remember, it wasn't until the 19th century that Germany became Germany and Italy became Italy in our modern sense of nation states. Spain, by the end of the Middle Ages, had already become a nation state with the joining of the houses of Castile and Aragon after most of the Moors had been driven back to North Africa or absorbed into the Spanish culture, especially of the southern part of the Iberian Peninsula. And so here too, a whole new kind of identity was beginning to develop, and the same kind of thing was happening in Portugal. So these countries are now, with this newfound sense of identity, are moving out. They're exploring around the world. The Dutch also are involved very much in this. They're exploring around the world, and probably at some point in school you studied some of the great Western explorers who are trying to go to the Far East and there find trade routes that would lead them to the spices of the East, and they went down around the coast of Africa and the Cape of Good Horn, and eventually ended up in the Indian Sea and so forth. But we're constantly trying to find yet other ways. And of course, eventually, with the 4 voyages of Christopher Columbus, it was demonstrated to most Europeans that it was possible indeed to cross the Atlantic and not only to exploit the riches of what came to be known as the New World, but also to open new kinds of markets. So, and of course, we have a long history of conquest by Western explorers moving into other continents, into North America, South America, Central America, Africa, the southern parts of Asia, especially Southeastern Asia, and establishing what they considered to be their own possessions, their own colonies, with the long history of exploitation, colonial exploitation that went along with that. But nonetheless, all of this was feeding the new wealth in Europe. And we have then a rise of the middle classes. A certain amount of social mobility is becoming possible, so that whereas in the earlier Middle Ages, very little social mobility was possible even for bright and talented people. But increasingly, it was becoming possible for people to move out of farming occupations, to move into the towns and cities, to get employment in as apprentices or even as indentured servants of kinds, so that they could learn skilled trades, and through learning these skilled trades they could eventually rise in their fortunes and therefore their influence. And over generations, a given family might well, not all at once, but over generations, a given family might well become very comfortable or even quite affluent, if not downright wealthy. So, a lot of things now are changing. And obviously this is going to create tensions for the old ruling order in Europe. And once again, their power was based mainly on control of large territories with agrarian economies. And as the economic base of Europe was shifting, not all at once to be sure, not completely to be sure, but was beginning to shift in certain ways that I've been talking about, that meant that opportunities for new classes of people began to arise. The education levels of ordinary people began to rise as well. And so we are going to see large-scale cultural shifts. The development of printing, the first printing press was introduced by William Caxton in England in 1476. The development of printing promoted the spread of literacy, and you will recall that I mentioned before that one of the principal sources of this new kind of push towards literacy was in the printing of translations of the Bible. And particularly among the new Protestant denominations, it became crucial for the members of those denominations to learn how to have access to the Bible directly themselves through being able to read the text for themselves. As Luther had one time said, every man his own priest. Every man his own priest. In other words, there was a movement away from the church as being the mediator between God and humans, such that the church would be the repository of the sacred scripture and then tell everybody what the sacred scripture really meant and keep unto itself the authority to do so. But increasingly now with the Protestant Reformation, during the early part of the 16th century, though in certain ways it had already really begun in the 15th century in small-scale movements, but especially in the early and middle parts of the 16th century, the Protestant Reformation was focused on the centrality of the Bible and making the Bible accessible to as many people as possible. Hence, the promotion of literacy. There was, of course, a critique of the traditional Christian church, the Church of Rome, the Roman Catholic Church, in the Reformation, but then also internally within what has traditionally been called the Counter-Reformation, or now some historians are calling the Catholic Reformation, which was the Catholic Church's response not only to the Protestant Reformation, but also to cleaning up many of the abuses that had developed in the latter part of the Middle Ages. And then we have culturally the emergence of a whole new set of values centered around what is called humanism. What is called humanism. Now, despite the qualifications that we could make by pointing to works like Chaucer's Canterbury Tales and to a certain extent Sir Gawain and the Green Knight, Nevertheless, the official culture of medieval Europe was focused not on this world, but on the next world. This world is simply a vale of tears. This world is simply a testing place in which we are expected to prove ourselves worthy of a heavenly afterlife after our deaths. In other words, there was a deliberate and official effort, not always successful, but nevertheless there was a deliberate official effort to promote a kind of otherworldly view of life, so that this life is viewed as a kind of pilgrimage through which we must pass on our way to the heavenly Jerusalem. You can see this even in the pictorial arts, that you look at the manuscript illuminations, you look at the sculptural programs and so forth, and what do they feature? They feature death as everywhere taking place around us, and for us looking toward a heavenly afterlife, we hope, rather than being condemned eternally to hell. There is very little celebration of the body or of things physical in medieval art. If you look, for example, for images of nude figures, we've talked about the images of nude figures here before in Western art. If you look for such images in medieval art, you don't find very many. And the few that you find are usually Adam and Eve, or figures like Adam and Eve, who are being driven out of the Garden of Eden by angels with fiery swords for the sins that they have committed, and they are trying to cover up their nakedness because their nakedness is a sign of their having become sinners. And then you get into the 16th century, and you look at all of those wonderful, wonderful paintings by Italian painters and sculpture by Italian sculptors in the Renaissance, and you have a celebration of the human body with a glorying in nude figures, both female and male. Now, you can all bring, I don't have the pictures here to show you, but you can all bring to mind the kinds of images that I'm talking about. So, what's that all about? Well, that's simply one of the manifestations of this new tendency to value the things of this world and of this life, to value things of our physical existence without giving up on the valuing of spirituality and the next world as our ultimate goal. Where does all of this come from? Well, in large part, it comes from a revival of the classics, especially classical literature and classical philosophy. Now, we've talked about the recovery of Aristotle from Arab scholars in the Central Middle Ages here before. But what happens in the 15th and 16th centuries is a large-scale effort to recover classical literature in as much of its entirety as was physically possible. And so the works of Plato become available. And the works of Plato were almost unknown. People knew about Plato, and people knew some Platonic ideas second or third hand. But the actual works of Plato, with a single exception, were not available in the Middle Ages. The same thing is true of many other ancient philosophers of Greece and Rome. And all this was now becoming available. Homer, for the first time in centuries, was actually becoming available, so that people who up to that time had simply heard about Homer and knew about some of the stories in Homer's epics now could actually read Homer for themselves. Now, it's true that they would have to learn Greek to do so, but the educational system was set up in such a way that what you studied from a very early age on were Latin and Greek, and then if you went far enough into higher education, you probably also studied a certain amount of Hebrew, at least a year of Hebrew. But you would have had years and years and years and years of Latin and then of Greek. Starting Latin somewhere around 5 or 6 years old, and starting in the study of Greek probably somewhere around 8 years old, 9 years old. And so by the time you finished your formal education, you really would know Latin well if you went all the way through the whole educational system, which is why learned works continued to be written and published in Latin for centuries. And that's one of the reasons why the learned vocabulary in English, you know, the so-called big words, the ones that you constantly find on SATs and GREs and so forth in the verbal sections, those are the words associated with the language of learning. What was the language of learning? It was primarily Latin, to some extent Greek, but primarily Latin. And that's why so much of the language of learning in English, even today, derives ultimately from Latin. That's also, if I may add a little footnote to that, that's also one of the reasons why I am told by the people who are experts in such tests that a student who takes even just 1 year of Latin or a Latin-based vocabulary course will score an average of 125 points higher than others on SAT verbal scores. Because you can figure out what the words mean, right? Because you can see the Latin roots and how the Latin roots have come to develop into our modern English words in so many cases. About 51 to 52% of our vocabulary derives ultimately from Latin. Now, you might think that runs counter to what I said earlier about French providing us with about a third of our vocabulary. But that's because there's an overlap. There are words that ultimately came from Latin, but came into English through French. Went from Latin into French, and then from French into English. And then there are other words that came directly from Latin into English. But clearly, those were words that people in the sciences were using. Those were words that people who were specialists in philosophy or in literature and so forth were using. So, very interesting, again, in terms of the development of our own language. And of course, we can trace similar kinds of developments among the other European languages as well. But that would take us too far afield in this course, interesting a topic though it is. Okay, so people are actually going back and they are reading and studying the classics. Well, why would they do that? Well, in part because the classics were the classics. And throughout the Middle Ages, even though they didn't have most of the texts directly available to them, they had a very powerful cultural memory of the importance of people like Plato and Socrates and Homer and Sophocles and so forth. So, when the opportunities began to arise for them to dig around in old libraries and archives, they did so, and of course, they eventually recovered these ancient texts. But why would they not have done it for so long, and then suddenly they begin to do this kind of searching in old libraries? Well, in part this was promoted within the Italian city-states originally by wealthy families who wanted to promote the idea that Italy once again was rising and would rise to be the pinnacle of Western culture. as it had been in the ancient Greco-Roman world before the collapse of the old Roman Empire. And that's the whole reason for the idea of a cultural renaissance. Renaissance. The word renaissance itself means a new birth, a rebirth. Naissance is the French word for birth. And the RE prefix means a new one, right? A new birth. Well, that presupposes that there has been a previous birth, right? I mean, you can't have a renaissance without some prior naissance. Well, the idea developed that back in the ancient Greco-Roman world, there was this huge, lofty pinnacle of civilization, and that was destroyed by barbarians at the end of the Roman Empire, and that we descended for a long time into what they came to call in the 15th and 16th centuries the Dark Ages, in which everybody was living in a kind of cultural darkness, and there was only an authoritarian church which held to itself what little learning had survived. Well, we now know that that's not what happened in the so-called Middle Ages. But notice that terms like Dark Ages or Middle Ages are themselves derogatory terms, right? I mean, that's obvious in the case of Dark Ages. But think about the term Middle Ages. Can you imagine somebody in the 12th century saying, gee, it's interesting living in the Middle Ages? Middle between what and what? Well, in the 15th and 16th centuries, it came to be in the interest of certain peoples, starting in Italy but spreading elsewhere in Europe, to think of themselves as once again rising to that pinnacle of civilization that they had experienced in the ancient world, their forebears had, and everything in between for 1,000 years or more was a long Middle Age, a kind of timeout for the development of civilization. Well, no modern historian really buys into that, but it's interesting that that was a widespread cultural ideology of the so-called Renaissance. And like many ideologies, it can become what the psychologists call a self-fulfilling prophecy. You know that concept in psychology? What does it mean? What's a self-fulfilling prophecy? Anybody have an idea? Yeah, okay, I think, okay, who's going to answer?
Oh.
Okay.
It means that if you believe that something is going to happen and you believe that you're going to turn out a certain way, or your community, something's going to happen, then because you believe that, you're going to make certain events happen so that that ends up happening in the long run.
Okay, that's right. Were you going to add to that?
No.
Basically, yeah, okay. Well, good. Thank you. Because that's what was happening. And that's what frequently happens with ideologies. That's one of the functions of ideologies. That's one of the reasons for promoting certain kinds of ideologies, whether they be political or nationalist or economic or social or religious or whatever. And so that was, in large part, what happened to the extent to which people bought into and came to believe in this ideology of a renaissance. They began to change their behavior. And if you are going to believe that you now are recreating the great world of your cultural past, you want to know more about your cultural past, right? And so there was an enormous amount of sponsorship and money poured into the sponsorship of scholars and writers who were going out and not only recovering the classics of antiquity, but also producing literature, paintings, sculpture, architecture, and the like, which were fulfilling the whole conception of a new classicism developing in the modern world. Okay? Look at the kinds of paintings I was talking about earlier. What do you find? I mean, so frequently those paintings are about classical figures, aren't they? From classical mythology. How many Venuses are there in Renaissance paintings and statues? How many stories out of Homer, or out of Greek tragedy, or out of Virgil are recreated in those paintings and sculptural programs? So, it's making come alive once again the humanism of classical antiquity in modern times. However, there's a difference. Europe has changed in certain ways. And to a very large extent, Europe has changed through the conversions to Christianity, uneven as they were. That doesn't mean that everybody was a devout Christian running off to church every day. But at least officially, the peoples of Europe had become Christian. And many of them, of course, were genuinely very, very deeply religious and deeply pious. But many were what we might call ordinary Christians, who went to church when they were required to do so and lived, outwardly, generally good lives and so forth. But this was not a constant preoccupation for them. And so one of the things that happened is that you have humanism now being revived from the classical past and Christianity coming together. And there are various possibilities here. There are some who appear to have become more or less purely humanist in their outlook and remained only nominally Christian. There are some, especially within the mystical and ascetic traditions, who were so otherworldly in their practice of their religious beliefs that they rejected humanism totally, or almost totally. But one of the most interesting phenomena developing at this time is something that has come to be called Christian humanism. Christian humanism. And Christian humanism is an effort to try to balance a valuing of human nature and of human life in this world with a belief that one ultimately should aspire towards salvation and a heavenly home in the next world. How do you try to come to a new cultural synthesis of Christian humanism? Well, that's what many of our writers are attempting to do, where within a framework of Christian belief, they're going to try to incorporate as much as they feel they can of these classical ideals, humanistic ideals. So, humanism, then obviously the value of the human and of life in this world. The models are found in classical art, literature, philosophy, and science. And then with the recovery of Plato's texts, there is an enormous interest in Platonism and the development of what came to be called Neoplatonism. Neoplatonism. So that we're about to look at some poetry in which the male poet will be celebrating the beauty, including the physical beauty, of his lady love or his would-be lady love, while at the same time he recognizes that her spiritual qualities are most important and are the qualities which make her truly beautiful. Physical beauty is fine, but physical beauty also passes away with time. Whereas spiritual beauty is something that will endure, and that this is true beauty, and that this is a reflection of the kind of true beauty that comes from the Spirit and ultimately from God. And ultimately from God. So that Neoplatonism, as it was joined with at least certain versions of Christian religion, became something like this. If we can go to the tablet, please. Okay. It was considered that there is some kind of absolute mind. Okay. I don't know what I'm doing here. I must be leaning on something. Am I leaning on something? Mind. And in this mind, there are the ideas or ideals according to which everything is created. Now let's just for the moment jump ahead, because this isn't exactly in Plato, but this is, let's jump ahead a little bit. What if you assume that that absolute mind is the mind of God, in the usual sense in which we use the term God? In the mind of God from all eternity, assuming now that God is eternal, right? From all eternity, will have existed the ideas according to which everything that is created would be created. Okay? I mean, if you buy into this notion, it makes perfect sense, doesn't it? It follows logically that if you believe what I just said, then you would believe that in the mind of God from all eternity, God had the idea of you, and that you have been created according to that idea of you. Okay? So by a process of what they called emanation, we get to the world of bodies below. And the world of bodies is simply a Platonic term for the world in which we live, in which look around and we have physical things, don't we? Physical realities. The world of bodies in that sense. Okay, so the basic idea is then that everything which exists in the physical world in which we encounter with our senses has its ultimate origin as idea in the mind of God. Okay? But when we return to the world of bodies, our world here, and we look around, we see each one of us looks different, right? I mean, some of us are female, some of us are male, some of us are taller, some of us are shorter, some of us have different skin tones than others, we're different ages than others. There are lots of things that distinguish us from one another and ultimately make us individuals, so that each one of us is, however slightly, different from all other individuals. But at the same time, we can recognize that there's something that we all share in. Some kind of being which is common to us all. That we are all human beings, right? I mean, yes, you're an individual, and I'm an individual, and you're an individual, and she's an individual, and so forth. But at the same time, we all share something in common, something which the philosophers called universal. These are the universals. And this is our common human nature. Now, once you grant that we share in a common human nature, we go back to the mind of God as creator, and God has in his mind, according to this Platonic or Neoplatonic concept, the ideal form of human nature. The ideal form of human nature, according to which each and every one of us has been created as a physical manifestation. But it is our physical manifestation of that ideal that makes us different from one another. Okay? Am I making sense so far? It is our manifestation of the ideal in physical form that makes us different from one another. Okay? So that obviously, physically, I look different from anybody else in the room. And we could say that about any individual here in the room. Okay? And notice that in our physical state, we do not really live up to the ideal form as it exists in the mind of God. In other words, in many ways, we are imperfect, aren't we? I mean, physically imperfect. I mean, nobody is absolutely perfect physically. And we're imperfect in other ways. I mean, we can make mistakes, we can stumble, we can fall, we can forget things sometimes, we can get confused, right? I mean, we have lots of imperfections, which mark us off from that ideal form of human nature as it would exist as idea in the mind of God. Now, let's carry this a step further. What becomes the sign of imperfection? The sign of imperfection is our physical nature. Okay? However strong we may be, however beautiful we may be, we're not perfect. And the very sign of our imperfection is our physical nature. Because the idea of us in the mind of God is not physical. It's not a body. It's an idea. It is spiritual. So notice then the next step that the Platonist or Neoplatonist will take. That this translates into a whole moral or ethical conception of human nature. That our higher nature is our spiritual nature, which ultimately relates us to God. And our bodies, our physical nature, as the principle of our imperfection, is what differentiates us from that spiritual nature that we would fulfill were we in the mind of God. I mean, fully in the mind of God. Is this making sense? And then when they came to consider the psychology of human beings, they established a kind of hierarchy in which reason was considered to be the highest of human faculties because the most spiritual and the most like unto the mind of God. This is a very dim reflection of God in us. And then you go on down through a hierarchy of psychological faculties until you get to the passions. Now, the passions are associated with the body, right? Anger, sexual passion, envy, gluttony, all of these kinds of passions are associated with the body. And to that extent, notice They pull us towards the body and towards fulfilling the desires of the body. And there's nothing wrong with that in and of itself, except when it pulls us away from the cultivation of what are considered to be our higher spiritual faculties, and especially the reason. Especially the reason is the highest of our faculties. Now, they take a step further. What should we do? What is proper for us to do? What is proper for us to do is for us to have reason as the highest of our spiritual faculties, and that which makes us, however distantly, most like God, that should be in charge of our personalities. But what happens if the body, the things of the body, and the passions associated with the body overturn the proper rule of reason? Well, that's where immorality comes from. That's where immorality comes from, according to this conception of things. Now, this way of thinking is so deeply embedded into our culture that it even affects our law. Do you know what the McNaughton principle in American law is? Anybody know that? The McNaughton principle in American law? According to that principle, in order to hold someone fully legally accountable for what he or she does at the moment of committing what is objectively defined as a crime, the person must have the full capacity of reason to distinguish between the rightness and wrongness of the act. Now, when you stop and think about that, that's very interesting. I'm not talking about psychology. I'm not talking about psychiatry here. I'm talking about the law. According to the law, you are not accountable for a crime that you commit if at the time of committing that law you did not have the rational capacity to distinguish between the rightness and wrongness of the act. Okay? And that is the legal definition of sanity or insanity. This has nothing to do with our friends in psychology. Not directly, anyway. Though there are constant conflicts. You know, because psychiatrists will come into court and they'll tell judges and lawyers and so forth, wait a minute, that's not what we mean by sanity or mental illness or whatever. That's not what we mean. And the lawyers will come back and say, but this is the legal definition. Okay? So what I'm getting at is a whole view of reality and a whole view of human nature is entering into Western culture. And this becomes very deeply embedded in many of our cultural productions, the law being just one. So now, if the lady of the sonnets, the lady to whom the sonnet writer writes his sonnets, says to him, no, I'm not going to have a sexual relationship with you because all you want is my body. And you're not really valuing what is most important about me, which is my spiritual self. And at first he feels sorry for himself and goes off and sulks and says she's cruel and unkind. And then eventually he converts and he comes around to her way of thinking. And then and only then is she going to consent to love him and to extend her love to him. But notice how that is rooted in a whole conception of human nature, in which our higher selves are our spiritual selves in this kind of dualism, and our physical selves, while not bad or evil in themselves, are associated with our lower selves in this way of thinking. I'm not trying to convert you here. I'm simply saying that this is the way that this particular system works. And we're going to see this coming up again and again and again in the poetry that we're going to be reading for the next several class meetings. So,